In about 10 minutes, Lucy found that it was a lamppost. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of a wood and wondering what to do next, she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming towards her. And soon after that, a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamppost. C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is Pints with Jack, Season 7, Episode 28, Narnia Month. Night Falls on Narnia. After Hours with Daniel and Phil from the Lamp Post Listener. Welcome, everyone. Here on Pints with Jack, we're reading our way through the works of C.S. Lewis. But we are currently in Narnia month. This season, we finally wrapped up the Chronicles of Narnia with The Last Battle. This year, some other podcasters also finished up The Last Battle. Daniel and Phil from the Lamp Post Listener podcast, and they're here to debrief with me today. But first, a quick little background. Daniel Payne is a classical educator whose love of Narnia was reignited while reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to a lower school class at the beginning of his career. Daniel has written classical curriculum for multiple books in the Narniad. He has also taught on Lewis in various professional and parochial settings. Phil Wisenhunt, am I saying that right, Phil? Wisenhunt, thank you, is a back-end developer at a startup company making clinical trial software. He's also an illustrator and has provided the Lamppost Listener with all 8 seasons cover art. Daniel and Phil, welcome back to Pints with Jack.
Thanks for letting us back in.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be back on the show. It's been a while. It's great to see you again.
Yes, it has been, and I have been really looking forward to this because, listeners, the reason we're doing this is I have finally finished the Narnia series. And so as people who have been with us for a very long time know, when David found out very early on that I had not read Narnia, he wanted to have me read it in real time, one every single season. And so I could not jump ahead, not that I probably would have because of my procrastination. But I had to save them for season, so we have just finished The Last Battle. As the time of this recording, we have already recorded that one with Andrew and his wife. And so it's just really fun to be able to sit down with these gentlemen, Daniel and Phil, and just to really chat about Narnia. You guys are the more or less the experts on this. You're doing this in depth. You're diving into these. You go into more depth than we do into these books. And so I'm just stoked to be here with you guys. I'm stoked to be chatting about this. Honestly, when I went and spent preparation this morning, going back through some of the Narnia books, reading some of my old notes, because we still have all the show notes, looking what stuck out to me. It was just so fun to like reminisce on the arc of the entire story, how the books connect, the different themes throughout it. So that's more or less what we're going to talk about. So I'm just excited to do this with you gentlemen.
We're thrilled to be here. And it's fun because Matt, we met in 2019 in person first.
Yes.
And then we've been on each other's shows and it's all been really enjoyable, but we both just recently finished the entire series and we took 2 different ways, 2 different paths to do it. I spread it out.
But it both took y'all 6 years to get there.
So Phil, you're like me.
I'm very much like you, but I spread it out where I did one chapter, every 2 or 3 weeks over the course of 6 years, and you waited 5.5 years, and then you read it all. It sounds like in 1 month.
Oh my goodness. Well, no. So just a clarification there. So I would do a book a season. So it has been 6 years for myself as well. This Narnia month, we didn't go through them all.
Okay.
I'm not sure exactly what David's the mastermind behind this. I'm actually not sure what's coming into Narnia month. I know obviously 2 of the episodes are going to be the Last Battle ones, which is what I did read just recently. I'm assuming he has another scholar or 2 probably tucked within there. Obviously, this episode's getting tucked within that month. But yes, The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe I read in 2017, then just go through the publication order 18, 19, 20. That's kind of the progression I did them.
Okay.
It was so interesting to go back, I'll say this, to The Lion and the Witch, to the show notes from 2017. And I actually text David, I'm like, man, we've come a long way. We had like 2 pages of show notes. Now we have like 30 pages of show notes for an episode. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but we had like nothing. I go, how did we even know to talk and what to talk about? So we're a lot more structured since then. Well, gentlemen, what are you guys drinking?
I am drinking today. This is actually Whistle Pig Farm Stock Rye. It's a whiskey out of Vermont. It was a gift to me from a student, well, a student's family. My students are not quite old enough.
Student.
Yeah.
What is this?
A student's family really blessed me this Christmas with a really nice bottle of rye whiskey. So that's what I'm enjoying this morning. Or this afternoon. I don't know why I made it sound worse than it is.
Yeah, you got double whammy here.
Yeah.
I love when Daniel talks about classical education and how great classical education is, but really the kids are just walking around with entirely full bottles of Whistle Pig.
Well, we're trying to we're taking after Lewis himself in the Narnia. How often are these kids taking wine? I mean, it's pretty regular that they are enjoying some wine in an effort to kind of lift their spirits.
I'm just glad there are no cigars.
So what about you, Phil?
For me, I have a liter of water and I refilled it right before we started recording.
Well done.
How about you?
I am doing a non-alcoholic Guinness only because I haven't done my exercise for the day. So after this and before Mass, I'm going to be doing a workout. And I was like, I probably shouldn't have scotch. Nothing to do with the time of the day.
I was wondering what that blue rim was on the drink. I thought maybe it was a blueberry Guinness. I wasn't really sure how to process that.
Yeah,
I thought you were going to say after this, but before Mass, I'll make sure to drink before, as if like I need to do that before I go to Mass. But
just a preparation, open myself up to the Spirit.
We recently, just as you were speaking of Mass in our parish, we recently went back. We've been doing intinction for the Eucharist just because of COVID for a long time. And then we just, obviously, a lot of those rules had all gone back to normal a long time ago, but we hadn't actually switched back to kind of taking from the common cup. And in our Anglican tradition, children, after they've been baptized, usually are able to partake in communion. And so as my son, for the first time, has started drinking from the common cup when he goes to partake in the Eucharist. And it's a new thing. We've had to talk to him about it because it is real wine. And this dude will really go for it. Like we're like, it's a sip. It's a sip of the wine. And he's gotten
more doesn't change it.
No, it does. We try to explain to him, the church traditionally has even said if you only take one element, that is sufficient, right? And so you don't need, it's just one sip is enough, right? You do not need to drink heartily from it. But that has been, that's so maybe you go into Mass, it's a similar thing for my son right now. Hey, calm down a little bit.
I can't wait until I have kids now for that exact reason.
Yeah.
That's going to be great. Well, beautiful. Well, you guys came on a show a few years ago to talk about the Voyage of the Dawn Treader movie, and you were more recently on a Half Pint episode with David last year. And then I think we all did the C.S. Lewis Reading Day.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
So what have you guys been up to since then? Like what's going on with the podcast? Where are you all at with everything?
Well, we've finished the Chronicles of Narnia. It's pretty crazy. I was reflecting on it this morning with my wife as we were just talking about coming on the show, and we were driving the kids around and just saying, it's Phil and I have not, besides our like Patreon exclusive podcast, we haven't actually started recording season 8 up to this point yet. And so this is the longest that I've gone on a podcast without talking about Narnia in 6 years at this point. The 7 books, we've gone through them. We're really proud of the fact that we made it through it. We did all of it. We were just talking before this about how a lot of podcasts aren't able to finish. And we're really happy that we were able to go through one chapter at a time. Each season, I really think getting better than the last season. And then about this time last year, so kind of in spring of 2023, we were starting to record Last Battle. And Phil and I were asking, the question of what comes next. We had ideas, and they had changed pretty regularly throughout the years of, okay, maybe we'll just go into some of Lewis's nonfiction, or maybe we'll go into the space trilogy. And there were some other things that we had kind of thought about too. And as we kind of had gone through this over the last 7 years, we just had enjoyed talking about children's literature and the role that it plays, especially on our imaginations, that we kind of have now been planning out for last year. What does the podcast look like as it transitions? We're focusing more just on what we're calling, beautiful works or, classical works of children's literature and the way that they communicate kind of transcendent truth to listeners. So we're spending this whole next season 8, we're calling Further Up and Further In, and we're really kind of using this season to kind of take a little bit of a paradigm shift for the show. The show is staying the same in that we're going to be going through beautiful works of literature, one chapter at a time, but we actually were like, I think no shade to you, Dave, you and David and Andrew. We're like, we kind of feel like Lewis would want us to keep going deeper and further into the world of children's literature instead of just maybe staying and just going back over and starting with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe again, right?
Yep.
And so we're going to be doing a whole year thinking about why do we care about these stories? Why do stories, especially like the Chronicles of Narnia, why do they stick with us? Why are they still available to read? Why do they move in us in a way that other stories don't? And so we're taking this season to think through these. We've got a lot of great guests and interviews that are coming up to help us think through beautiful classical works of children's literature. And then in season 9, which we're about a year away from at this point, we're going to be going into The Princess and the Goblins. We're going to George MacDonald for at least one season, and then we'll kind of see where we go from there.
I love that.
The big thing for us has just been setting the next few seasons up.
It's interesting timing when you say that, because I was listening to Jordan Peterson. I don't remember who he was talking to, some Catholic scholar of some sort, but they were talking about how the scholar is going to start writing really good children mythology, because he felt like that's really been lost in these last couple decades. We used to have these great stories that really shared a lot of exactly what you're talking about. And it's just, unfortunately, the way the culture has gone and shifted over the last maybe 5, 10, 15 years, there's been a loss of that. And so it is interesting. This is very, I think, great timing. I think the world kind of needs also the shift you guys are about to do, bringing that back and the beauty of those stories. So I think it's awesome.
Well, and I think just too, one of the things that all of us are right around the same age. And so we're in the age where people are getting married, having kids, and you're thinking about, we've got 2 little ones. And often my wife and I think a lot about, when it even comes to like, we're not like big, we don't do a lot of screens and stuff, but we'll do like a family movie night on Fridays and stuff. And even not just books, we're just thinking any stories. There's a tendency, and I really feel it. I was really judgmental about parents until I had my own kids. And now I still try not to do it, but I do understand the temptation and then just throwing something on the TV or just finding any book on the bookshelf, just be like, whatever, hey, kind of lowering the bar. So it's either TV becomes, I need to wash the dishes, and this is the one thing that can do it, is throwing something on the TV and my kids are distracted. Or just, hey, I know that reading is important, so I'll just pick any book off the bookshelf and just read it to my kid. And hey, I've done the job. I've kind of checked the I read with my kid box. Mm-hmm. And I do really understand the temptation. I still don't think it makes it a great thing, but I understand why people kind of fall into that trap. But I think for those of us who are starting families, have younger kids, one of the things we really want to be mindful of is that the stories that we introduce our children to and that we help cultivate our children's loves, they really matter. And I think a lot of people are, especially kind of as postmodernity has kind of gone the way that it's gone, I think there's a large minority, but still a minority. Many of us are in the kind of religious world thinking about, hey, it's actually, I really do care a lot about what stories or what movies. Like there's movies out there that are like actually inappropriate for my son. And then there's movies that are not inappropriate, but they're just not really life-giving. They're not really worth his time. Like his time is more, and I think that often, especially in the last 30 or 40 years, a lot of the focus, especially on Christian culture, has been just avoiding the things that are bad, not pointing our children to the things that are good. And so what we really want to do with this podcast is really, and take really long looks. I mean, we're still going 1 or 2 chapters at a time. We want to take it slow, right? It'll take us a whole season to get through The Princess and the Goblin, but wanting to think through, let's really investigate. Let's learn why is this work by George MacDonald, or why were these 7 books that we've looked at, why are they good stories? Yeah, I know that they're good. I've been told that they're good. C.S. Lewis told me they're good, and I trust him. But let's learn a little bit more about why they're good. Why are they life-giving and living books? And so that's we're really excited for this.
And part of the hope for me is to trace stuff back, going back through time, seeing who influenced the people that we really enjoy. So I'm sure that C.S. Lewis influenced so many people that I've read, authors from the 60s to the 2020s. But I'm really enjoying reading slightly older books and then reading their influences. So I've loved science fiction. I love the science fiction that's coming out today. I love the science fiction that's coming from different places. Science fiction from China is very different than science fiction from the US. But then reading Dune, which was published in 1965, I was surprised by how familiar it felt and how many tropes there were. But then to find out, well, the tropes started here. And then if you go back a little bit further, some of these were, influenced by books that were coming out in the 1930s. And so I'm hoping that we love Lewis. We're going to read George MacDonald. Maybe we can go back further. And in a kind of beautiful meshing, Daniel is also coming from a classical education background where they're really reading old stuff, and they're reading stuff from more than 2,000 years ago. And it's all coming together in a great way where you can see here are the elements that stand the test of time. But also there's room for iteration, and some things can improve and other things may not work quite as well. And then if you zoom in, like you were talking about, maybe the past 10, 15 years hasn't been the best, but maybe there are a few gems that we can pick out and use that as the basis for the next 10 to 15 years.
That's going to be incredible. And should I read Dune and Dune 2?
I would recommend Dune 1 for sure.
Okay.
I enjoyed a lot of pieces of Dune Messiah, which is the second book. And if they make a third movie, that's what it'll be based on. It is very different, and there are some really cool ideas, but it is pretty different. And I have fought my way through the first half of the third book, and I'm starting to like it a little bit more, but it's definitely more of a labor of love than just pure enjoyment.
Is it really love though? The way you've been talking about it, it feels like just labor.
No, like I feel like sometimes the harder stuff, you have to work through it to get to a point where you can enjoy it. And Dune certainly felt like that in the middle.
Like Till We Have Faces?
Well, I haven't read that, but maybe Daniel can speak to that.
Andrew might not like that comment. But
Yeah, I don't know that he would enjoy that, but
yeah. Have you seen the movie then? Final question on that.
Yes. Yeah, I've seen both part 1 and part 2.
How's the movie relative to the book?
not as good.
Not as good as the book?
No. Phil and I actually saw the movie together. It was late at night and we didn't talk about it as much. I thought the movie was Denis Villeneuve. So I only go to the movie. I've been to the movie theater 4 times since COVID. I've gone once a year with Phil. It just hasn't happened as much. And then I just watch stuff at home or whatnot. So we went to the movies together. We saw this. We didn't actually debrief it together, Phil, a ton.
Yeah.
I felt like Denis Villeneuve, he's a good director. He turns out good movies. It was, but I still was pretty underwhelmed, honestly, with the movie compared to the book. I think often, and this is such a cliche thing, but it's because it's true. It's cliche and it feels cliche because it's such a true statement, which is it just oversimplified, I think, some of the complexity of the book, some of the inner, character development was just simplified in a way. I thought it also felt a little too modern as well. It was by no means a bad movie, like absolutely looked beautiful, well acted. Nothing was bad in it. But I thought it was a step down from the book, which even I will tell you, I think the book is just fine.
Because I'm like debating right now. I enjoy science fiction, not super passionate in that sense, but when I've come across really wonderful ones, some of my favorite books have fallen in that category.
Sure.
And so I'm like, do I just watch the movies or do I go and actually do the book first? And it's that quick because I haven't done either of this one and I just heard about it. So I'm kind of torn in my head of what I'm going to do.
The piece of advice that Daniel gave me that helped the most with the book was being willing to look stuff up, because the book is written as if everybody knows what the terms mean, and it gives it a really real sense. This book is set in 10,000 something AD, so it's pretty far in the future, but there are lots of influences that the author had, and so there are these terms that he's made up, there are these people that he's made up, and everything feels like he is making a world and then writing a story about it. Similar to Tolkien, definitely not at that level, but he's not as organized. And there's one mistake where there's a character who's young at the beginning of the book and he's old at the end of the book, and not that much time has passed. But it's still pretty good for someone who wrote the story by himself on a typewriter, and he kept track of everything so well.
That's impressive.
I would start with the book. If you haven't seen the movie yet, I feel like that's the best way to go. And then you get to see the treat of the visuals, because the visuals are incredible.
All right. I like it. Well, gentlemen, let's dive in. We talked a little bit ahead of time of kind of what I'm looking to accomplish on this episode. And so let's just start. And actually, Phil, let's start with you, given that you and I are in the exact same dynamic of having just gone through this and never have. Well, Daniel, had you read it before you did this? I
had read all the books except Horse and His Boy.
Perfect. So Phil, let's start with you in this, like, first of all, overall impressions now that you've brought it to completion, but maybe like what was the favorite book? What was a favorite theme that you just really loved throughout it that just sticks with you, that impacted you from, it doesn't have to be from whatever your favorite book is, but just kind of give, now that you've brought it full arc, your thoughts.
I'm curious if someone will ever go back and listen to all the times that we answered this question, because I'm sure our answers change. Daniel's probably able to keep track of it a little bit better. The best answer I've heard to this question came from C.S. Lewis's stepson, and he said, the book that I just read is my favorite one, and that it changes all the time. And I feel like right now, that is how The Last Battle feels. It was the one that I was the least familiar with. I had no idea what was going to happen going into it. I feel like the scene at the very end, and I'm hoping that people are listening to this and are okay with spoilers if the books have been out for a while.
Yes, if you haven't, you should just stop and go listen to the whole thing of Lamppost Listener and then our like 18 episodes that went through this.
Yeah, see in 67 hours.
Because we're going to be talking plenty of spoilers.
Exactly. Yeah, I think the further up and further in scene, I finally understood why everyone was quoting that in their emails. And I feel like the representation of the life to come after this one, it was just so beautiful, and it tied the series up in a great way, but also left so much to the imagination. Considering that was the end of the Chronicles, and that it still left me with that sense of wonder about what could happen. That's a beautiful thing. And then I want to make sure I get the name right. Daniel, it was Emeth who they were surprised.
Yes, was in Aslan's country. Yeah, right there in the penultimate chapter.
I feel like that moment has stuck with me just for a very long time.
I'm so bad with names and details. Was he the one that in a very pure way was serving the wrong god?
Yeah, correct. That's Emeth.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then Aslan said, everything that you did for him, I consider having done for me. A rough paraphrase. We talked about it on the show. That's a pretty controversial stance. But I also think I feel like there's enough room for that to be thought about for a long time. And I think that is a moment in the book that has influenced how I interact with people probably the most in the past year or two of doing the show. We don't know for sure what's going to happen. And this gives me a lot of grace and just kind of compassion for people who maybe think differently than I do, or have had a different set of influences or upbringing or just life events. And I'm really grateful for that. It gives me food for thought for a lot of reasons. I'm still wondering, I look forward to hearing about this later. If we get to have a Q&A in heaven, how close was Lewis on this?
Before passing it to you, Daniel, to get your thoughts on this, I'll just quickly piggyback off this because you practically said everything that I was going to say here in a beautiful sense. I'm so glad. I have a very similar thought to you. A lot of the books that I went through, I felt that as well, first of all. So I second that. I didn't as much with The Magician's Nephew, to be honest. That's a side thing. We'll circle back to that when we get there. But yeah, the last battle for me, it was like, there's something incredibly relatable about the last battle in the sense that there's this good and evil going on in our world today. And evil can be very enticing, very appealing. The false Aslans can be very hard to be able to see the difference between a false Aslan and the real Aslan. Now, obviously in our case, Christ. And I wrote the exact same thing. I love that. I didn't actually remember his name, so I'm glad you did, Emeth, because I thought that as well. It was really beautiful to know that, because there's something scary about how deceptive these things can be. What if we get it wrong? What if we're going and trying to do the best we can, but we get it wrong? And it was like nice to see Lewis put that in there. And so I would say The Last Battle was my favorite one, and I would say for almost the same reasons you did, Phil. I really love that. What about you, Daniel?
Yeah, it's always hard to pick a favorite one, right? But I definitely won't pick The Last Battle simply because that wouldn't be fun if we all answered the same thing. I've been pretty consistent with Dawn Treader throughout the last few years that is my favorite. But I'll say that, it's like really any of them could be for the most part. Even ones that I didn't love as much at the time. When we went through Magician's Nephew, I actually was like, this is not one of my favorite, but I still really enjoy it. And even something like Caspian, which I think sometimes feels like its ideas are a little bit less well developed than some of the others. Mm-hmm. There's certain parts of it that just really stick with me. And I'm not just like individual scenes. You can like watch a bad movie or read a kind of an underwhelming book, which like, but there's a few good scenes. I don't mean it in that way. because I really think it's still a strong work of literature, but there's certain elements and themes. That whole idea that, Lewis says that Caspian is about the restoration of the true religion after its corruption. And that whole theme, I don't think it's executed nearly as well as, the theme itself is, but it's just really interesting to think about what do we do when the religion has been corrupted, right, by the Telmarines. I think, though, one of the things that I have really kind of latched onto as far as kind of like thematic details in the Narniad, we finished Last Battle, and we spent a lot of time there at the end focusing on what in the world Lewis was doing in those last few chapters, right? And as I've thought more about it and reading it, I read it both with Phil, so I read it with adults and then I talk to an adult about it. Also read these books with children and talk to them about it. I feel like I have this really wonderful privilege to be able to see it in kind of both worlds, both as children's literature, but then also both see the depth that Lewis is working with. And one of the things that Lewis does so well in the books, that I think it's one of the things, people know this, what I'm about to say is by no means any kind of revelation. It's been said before, but it's just what I particularly am latching onto right now, is Lewis's ability to tell a great story with the kind of depth of imagination that leads you, like you can be completely ignorant of it the first time you read through certain parts, and yet going back and spending more time in that world, spending more time with his words and with the story is rewarding and revealing in many ways. I think about, when you read chapter 12 of The Silver Chair and you get to the Lady of the Green Kirtle comes out and she tells the children, there was no sun. None of this stuff is real. We had a guest on for that particular episode and we talked a lot about how, this is just straight up Pascal's wager, right? And no 7-year-old reading that is going to know Pascal's wager, right? At the very end of The Last Battle, Lewis just goes full on Platonic metaphysics, right? With the theory of forms and the way that works. And you can read that. You don't have to go, wow, this is Plato's theory of the forms, right? You don't have to know that. But as you get older and hopefully maybe you're becoming more, familiar with the works of Plato, you start to read and go, oh my goodness, Lewis is, so many of these beautiful ideas he's introducing are really entry points for further reading and further learning. And, I can't really think of another series for children that is so welcoming and invitational in the way it literally does ask you to go further up and further into great ideas, into great works. It really is invitational in a way that Lewis almost says, come spend time here, but don't stay here forever. And that doesn't mean don't reread it, because obviously we do that all the time. And I love rereading these books, but there's an invitation into something deeper. And I think that's what's really interesting is in the way that Lewis presents kind of the Narnian metaphysics, meaning both kind of the physical and the supernatural. We live Lewis is writing, I should say, in a very modern world that really downplays the supernatural and kind of probably overemphasizes the physical. You think about kind of post-Enlightenment philosophy, you have people are overly kind of a post-Baconian like view of what we see in front of us is the most real thing, right? And Lewis is not necessarily saying, hey, the real doesn't matter. He's not a Gnostic by any means, but he's saying, but we cannot forget about the supernatural. We cannot forget about the spiritual. And I think his books do that in a way. You think about the way that the last thing I'll say here is you think about the way that he so regularly describes food. There's like a physicality to these books. I was teaching a class recently on Lewis for adults, and one of the adults was reading through it for the first time, was like, he talks so much about food. I had no idea to expect so much food. And there often is this really interesting juxtaposition of physical food and the wonders of that with also these very supernatural, magical, mystical, intangible elements. And Lewis just wraps that up in a way, in a very medieval kind of like worldview, and saying, the supernatural world is directly connected to the physical world. And again, all of these things are not something a 7-year-old is going to pick up on.
Yeah.
But you don't have to pick up on it because the stories are so strong and beautiful, and that you can kind of return back to them and start realizing it. And Lewis is kind of planting seeds in that very like almost kind of biblical imagery. He's just planting seeds of imagination and of transcendent truth that eventually can continue to grow in children, especially as they read them, grow in us and as adults as well too. So that's what I think is so special about these books, so unique about these books, that I don't think exist in many other works of children's literature.
Well said. You're making me like get really excited to, Lord willing, have kids and be able to go through these with them.
Yeah, it's so great.
I already had being engaged and having a wedding date picked. I already have massive baby feeder. You just made it worse. Let's just make that clear. What I want to do, I have a thought, but I want to let you guys give a thought first and we can kind of unpack this a little bit. I want to attempt to see how you guys would say, what's the thread that connects all of the books together really well? Like, what's that thing where if people keep this in the back of their mind, they see this constantly representing itself in the different books? Because obviously some of them have different characters. Sometimes there's none of the original Pevensie, or however you say that, Pevensie, children. And so that's not necessarily the thing that's holding them all together. What would you guys say to that?
I love thinking about, especially in a series that has multiple books, who are the characters that show up every single time? Daniel and I digress into talking about Star Wars quite a bit, and there are two characters that are always there, that appear in every single thing. They're droids. It's R2-D2 and C-3PO, and I think about, okay, who is in every single chronicle and who has an influence in every single one? Because you don't see all the children. Every child has maybe 2 or 3 total, and then if you count the last battle, everybody comes back except for Susan. Aslan is the force that is consistently there, but it's the way that Aslan interacts, or the way he doesn't interact, that I think it makes that unifying force the whole time. I'm sure that there's lots to say about Aslan being there, but I also think it's when Aslan's not there and you see characters interacting with each other and moving forward without him, but still aware that he is this presence, he's this force, and that he will come back. And it makes it feel very relevant to today, where it's been 2,000 years, but we still have hope that Jesus will come back. And we hope that that'll be soon, but we just don't know. But I also think that there are Aslan pop-ins where he comes in and he'll be there, but he doesn't wrap everything up. He may nudge someone in the right direction, or change their point of view, or give them some information that they didn't have before. Like, hey, like, you weren't supposed to hear that. You were eavesdropping. That's what that was. And he just calls it out, but that's not the end of the story yet. So to me, that's kind of the main thing. But then I love that it ends with Aslan has been in charge the whole time.
Yep. And
there is a finality to it. And I think we look forward to that as well, because it's hard. If you're in the middle of a world right now, there's a lot of messed up stuff. It's hard to know for sure there's this good force out there. But to me, these books remind me that, yes, like, this is a brief moment, and Narnia playing with time compared to our time helps with this too. But it's just, that's a moment compared to this grand story of, I think the timeline of Narnia is 2,500 years or so compared to less than 100 in Earth time.
To add on to that, because Phil, I was going to say a really similar thing. I mean, I would say the biggest through line for me would be Aslan's sovereignty throughout all 7 books. And it's the kind of thing, it's one of those truths that almost sounds too simple, right? Of course we know that. We know that, if Aslan is this supposal of Christ, of God, right, then that's so simple that of course he's in control, because we know God's in control, but we really don't, right? I mean, that's the things we always struggle with as humans, right? Whether it can be something as, well, and I don't mean this offensively, Matt, for you, something as boring and monotonous as looking at my like Roth IRA or something, right? Or finances, or something that I would feel like is so meaningful, like worrying about a student who I'm like, I'm really concerned about 10 years from now in this student, right? And then trying to then ask, and again, in those moments, right, whether you're looking at your retirement plans or you're looking at, a student's future or a loved one's future, right, as a follower of Christ, you know that God is in control. And then the bigger question is, okay, we know that Christ is sovereign, and yet I still have a part to play. And what does that look like? Like, I can't, if I just decide to never contribute to my Roth IRA, right? Or if I decide to, okay, I've got a student who's really struggling, and I just go, well, too bad for them. It's not my fault, when that literally is my job, right? I have a role to play. I can't just say, well, God's in control, so we're going to do nothing because God's sovereign. So if I really just never put money into my retirement account, God will magically put money there. He resurrected Christ, so he certainly could. He could put $1 million into that account, but I probably do need to be participating in that. I probably do need to be like, all right, if I've got a student, whether it's a behavior issue or if it's an academic issue, I do need to be pouring into the student. I can't just say, well, I'm only going to pray about it. And I think that idea of Aslan is sovereign, and yet the children have work to do, and trying to figure out what work is it, how much work, and then the question of, well, how sovereign is Aslan? Now, we know the Sunday school answer is completely sovereign. But then the question is, well, what does that exactly look like? What does that actually, manifest in the world? What is it? Because go back to Caspian, think about Lucy as they're asking, why would Aslan allow this to happen, right? We saved Narnia, and here 1,000 years later, it's been overrun. The castle we were crowned and coronated in is literally in ruins. Why would he let this happen? Right? Think about Shasta and the horse and his boy, of like, where is Aslan this whole time? The same way that Esther asked the question, where is God when all of this is happening? And I think that's the question that we ask now as humans. It's one of the biggest questions, not the only question we ask as humans, but that's one that we consistently ask. Even if we have a strong faith, we still ask, well, what am I supposed to do? What should I do with the life that God has given me? Narnia never fully answers that question. Don't get me wrong. It only reassures us in that, we can't always know, but we still just have to trust that Aslan is sovereign, because the kids don't know. The children don't know how much they have to do. And in fact, in the last battle, we see them utterly fail, right? Everyone fails at that last battle for the most part. And it's only through Aslan's sovereignty that they're able to actually travel further up and further into his country. And so I think it helps us ask these questions that we really do begin when we're young readers, asking, what is my place in the world and who am I, right? These are questions of identity and of purpose, right? Questions that are really confusing in the 21st century, right? There's a lot of questions about purpose and about identity. And there's questions, asking them are not inherently bad. Human beings have asked them literally forever. Adam and Eve asked these questions as humans, right? But we need to have a stable, firm answer. And what Lewis does point us to is that answering these questions that answer has to be found in something stable. And there is nothing more stable than the triune God, or Aslan in the case of Narnia. And so I think that is something in particular that you find seeds of that in every single one of the books. And it really, again, draws it out really slowly if you're younger, maybe a little bit faster if you're older, but it's there. It's really there.
I'm so glad, Phil, you brought this up, Daniel, you brought it home more or less too. I mean, this is what I love about having come from this fresh. Surprisingly, that did not stick out to me at first until I literally, in preparation for this episode, took a step back. And I kind of wished I would have had this exact template that you guys mapped out to think about it, because it would be really fun to go through a book now with this knowledge, with a singular lens. I would not recommend someone do this first. It's fun to take the books in as they come and experience the whole world. But to be asking yourself, how is Aslan? Where's his sovereignty in here? How is it manifesting itself? What's our role in that? All these questions that you guys just brought up. In every book, that's different. Sometimes it's direct intervention. Sometimes he's intervening through others and the people that he puts with you. Sometimes he comes at the very end. So you're forced to kind of have a deep amount of trust in growth, in surrender. And then right when you get to that last point where you're about to break and give up, he shows up. Sometimes he shows up in the really beginning and you literally have the path in front of you mapped out. I'm thinking of the silver chair, but then also the world will put all these doubts to you and you have to overcome those doubts. You have to hold on to the truth that you know to be true that was taught to you in the beginning. These are all things that all of us can relate to. I know there's certain parts of my life where God made it very clear, and then I still ended up doubting on a journey because then things start coming up. And so I don't know why, as I was reading it in real time, that never stuck out to me. And that's why I'm so glad you guys brought this up. I just think that's absolutely incredible.
That's something that doing this podcast and reading so slowly, one chapter, recording every week or two, has shown me that, if you really slow down, you can see stuff like this. And it's changed the way I read other things. And I agree, Matt, that you shouldn't try to do this on that first read. Just enjoy it, but definitely on the second read. And then even engaging with stuff in different forms. So watching the movie of something or watching the play. My wife and I just saw To Kill a Mockingbird, the Aaron Sorkin version on stage. And I read the book in school and I saw the play in school, but then to see this play, this different version through a different lens, you're looking out for more stuff. And now that I'm looking for, how are they doing exposition? How are they catching people up who aren't familiar with the story? How are they having these characters interact? And again, I wouldn't start with this, but I like reading, okay, here's a synopsis of everything that happens in this series. What's the overall arc? And then rereading the book and saying, that's how this fits in here. And maybe you disagree with the synopsis that you found online. Maybe there are different elements. But to me, I think this is what English class was supposed to be. But
if you go to a classical school.
I was like, you come to one of our schools and you actually, it will be like that.
Well, I feel like, truly in part, doing this podcast with Daniel as he gets more and more into the classical education scene has enhanced this for me. And I think that there's also you remove the element of, just everybody's here and they don't want to be. But I think when we're a little bit older, we're finally ready to dive deeper into these stories. And I think we're all looking for these core elements because when they're done well, it's so special and it's supposed to be cherished.
Well said. Well, let's build from this. And what I want to do for the rest of this is to go book by book, not in depth. We won't have a lot of time. So, maybe it's like 3 minutes we kind of spend on a book, 3, 4, 5 minutes. But essentially just going through what was something that really stuck out to you, like that you remember, like a beautiful theme. Maybe you want to connect it back to Aslan's influence, or if there was just something that you remember that was just so beautiful about that. And so let's start with A Lion, a Witch, and a Wardrobe. And we'll start with you, Daniel.
Sure. I mean, with Wardrobe, it's really hard to beat kind of the iconic imagery. I think there's other books in the series that also have really beautiful imagery in them, but the world that you're introduced to in Wardrobe is just enticing. It's almost intoxicating in a way. Yeah. And I've mellowed on David doesn't like this about me, but I've mellowed on my passion for publication versus chronological order the more we've read the books, and that I honestly don't think it matters. I don't really care one way or the other, with the exception. It's a
good thing I'm here and not David.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's actually why we asked him to join us, and he was like, not unless Daniel goes publicly out and apologizes for his newfound beliefs. I will not be on the show.
He did ask me to text him if you said this. So I'm going to look at my phone real quick.
With the exception, I will say that you have to start with Wardrobe and you have to end with Last Battle. And then, do I think it's the most beneficial to read them in publication order? Absolutely. Do I really think, like, if I've got a student who wants to go to the library and they've just read Wardrobe and Caspian and they don't have Dawn Tread, I'll be like, yeah, go read Horse and His Boy. It's fine. Like, I won't be like, no, wait a few weeks. I'm like, no, go read it now. Yeah. So I just don't care as much, but I think you have to start with Wardrobe, not just because it makes the most sense, because there's lines like in chapter 6 or 7 where, Lewis says, hey, they don't know anything about Aslan just like you do. Kids will get over that kind of stuff. I think what's more important is the way that Lewis very meticulously introduces the world of Narnia. We see it for a little bit through Lucy and Tumnus, then she goes back, we get some more. It's not a jump right in. You kind of just get your feet wet. You wade in the pool for a little bit before you actually really dive in. It's not till chapter 6 where you spend the rest of the book in Narnia. And I think that journey into Narnia and that slow way with the very beautiful prose and the descriptive language, I think is what's most outstanding more than anything else. I mean, the themes are obviously there. You've got a retelling of the gospel that's extremely beautiful. But for me, the biggest standout is the way in which the world is introduced. I think it's probably the one that makes you want to go to Narnia the most, despite the fact that Narnia is being ruled by a tyrant, right? It's the one you're like, I want to go there. Yeah.
And, piggybacking off that, for me, what stuck out, because I had to think back pretty far because it's been a while. So something that sticks with me this long must have been at least something that stuck out pretty aggressively 7 years ago when I first read this. was just, everything you said. Who was the person that like gets introduced to this? Lucy, that childlike wonder. And that just continued throughout the entire series. And Lewis, I believe, didn't like plan on writing all of the other ones. So a really key theme he wanted us to understand was not only this gospel story and Aslan and the Sepulso, but also who's the person that sees it the most? Who's the person that his heart is open to receiving this the most? And I just think there's such a beautiful lesson with that. The more I've gone through life and the more people I've met that Chesterton go through life with gratitude and wonder and awe. I mean, there's just such a truth to that. And he continued to play that throughout the themes. That was something that really stuck out to me. What about you, Phil?
Whenever I have questions like this, it's always the small moments that I end up loving. I love when they're packing up with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver or the conversation right before that, and then also packing up. I love the moments with the professor, and I love how that comes back into play books later, depending on which order you read them in. But just, there's something about characters talking about the world that they're in and revealing grand amounts of information. But then there's also something about characters talking about stuff without saying how much they know. So the Beavers know a lot, and it's an exposition. It's a whole data set coming from Mr. and Mrs. Beaver about Aslan's on the move. He's not safe, but he's good, all that. But then the professor says just enough to get them to give Lucy another chance. But he doesn't reveal how much he knows or how much of his story is there. And, who knows what Lewis knew at the time that he was writing that. But there was enough that he knew that he was planting some seeds. I really enjoy the small moments.
Well said. All right, Prince Caspian.
Yeah, I mentioned that Lewis gives that synopsis for his own book, which is really great. It's the only book that really Lewis tells us exactly what, the purpose in writing it is. And he says it's the restoration of the true religion after its corruption. If you really kind of hone in on that idea, when you read the book, it's quite easy, and I think even for a young reader, to see the ways in which it's about taking Narnia, bringing it back to the way it was established at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I think it's also interesting in the way that it complicates things a little bit. You have a very kind of a beautifully simple, I don't mean this pejoratively, but it's beautifully simple. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's just straight good guys versus bad guys, and it's very clear who's a good guy and who's a bad guy, and there's zero overlap. But Caspian introduces a little bit more of a complex world. You've got characters like Trumpkin. You've got Nickabrick, right? And then you've even got Caspian and his role in the fact that he is a Telmarine himself, right? And remember, there's that one scene where all the Narnians come together at the dancing lawn, and people are frustrated about Dr. Cornelius because, as I believe, he's only half dwarf. And there's this kind of like frustration, a little bit of infighting. We don't see any of that in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. All the Narnians all love each other. They're all like hippies living out in the Aslan commune. Things are great. And then they just fight the evil bad guys, right? But then here in Caspian, we see that because this true religion has been corrupted, it's led to infighting, and it's even led to some places where you're not really sure who's good or bad. And again, you have characters like Nickabrick, who is willing to, wants to rightly overthrow the Telmarines, who are these evil, unjust, villains ruling over Narnia, but he's willing to do it no matter the cost. He's willing to go to the hag. He's willing to go to the werewolf, even thinking about going to the witch herself, right? Or if it's the movie version, actually just literally going to the witch. And in that, that's an interesting idea that Lewis is toying with here of, all right, we want to restore the true religion, but there actually is a right way to restore it, and there's a wrong way to restore it. And that's a really interesting thing. I think that's actually probably one of his most complex, mature themes in all of the Chronicles, which is also one of the reasons why I think that maybe Caspian doesn't sit. It's not that it doesn't sit well, but it's not as memorable to some people, is because it has a little bit more of that complexity to it. And especially if you're reading it as a child, it kind of might go over your head to a certain extent. I think, like I said earlier, I think you can pick up on some of those things, but it is a little weighty. And so I love that about the book, even though it's not one of my favorites. I do think that makes it really interesting, the way that Lewis just kind of the 1-2 punch. Again, if you do read this in publication order, if you read Wardrobe, where it's this like perfect, wonderful, good versus evil, and then Caspian, it's a really different shift. And I think that's an interesting thing.
Well said. What are you thinking, Phil? I almost said Will.
This book is so different than Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. I think I love how there are these connecting threads, and they're very small, and it's through props. It's 1,300 years later, and they're finding all their old stuff, but there's one prop missing, and that creates this mystery, and then that prop is used, and it brings everybody together, and it continues the story throughout. But I think it represents how willing Lewis was to break away from what he knew worked and try something else, but he put enough craft into it that it holds up on its own. Because you could throw everything out the window, but he sticks to some core stuff. We still have swords. We still have great big battles. We have good guys and bad guys. He adds a little bit more complexity, like Daniel was saying. But I really enjoy how he could have rehashed the same thing, and it probably would have sold just fine. But I think the reason it's still around is because it's different, and it's not the same story being told 7 times. He does something very different with every single book.
That's a good point, because there's so many popular authors today, whether it's in the fiction side of things, psychological thriller. This is really a big thing where they just honestly have a repeat plot that sells really well, and they just tweak things around. I never really thought about that, but Lewis really ventures out. Let's turn to Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which would have been another one that would have been in the running for me for favorite. I really did like Voyage of the Dawn Treader, but let's start this time with Phil. So we're not always doing Daniel, then Phil.
We are all sharing notes, and Matt, I can see your notes, but I swear this was mine before. If you had asked about Voyage of the Dawn Treader, it would have been the undragoning that stood out to me.
It's so good. Like, I remember that. Sorry to jump in here, but I remember at that point when I came across it, I had just gone to a retreat probably within 6 months of that, of false self versus true self. Really started diving into the ego, diving into that whole false self idea, authentic self. And then I come across this, and I was really wrestling with, I started to also be pretty aware of what is more my false self I present to the world, the posturing and stuff. But then I tried to stop it, and I'm like, wow, it's really hard to get rid of that. And then I come across this undragoning, and I'm like, this is just money.
Yes. It's because it's painful.
Yes.
It's so good after the fact, but it's painful in the process of it.
Yes.
I think about that with minor things, and an example just from very recently. My wife and I are about to have a baby.
Congratulations, making me more baby fever.
yeah. This will add.
Is this the first?
This is the first one.
Congratulations.
Yeah, we got an upcoming wedding for you and a baby for Phil.
I love it.
Big time to be recording. So we're only weeks away, and I was prepared for things to change once the baby was here. But what I wasn't prepared for, and what kind of blindsided me a little bit, was all the preparation that goes into getting ready for the baby to be here.
Good thing you have Daniel.
Yeah.
He's seen it. He comes over to our house sometime, because we just live a few blocks away from each other. And Phil's been here at the end of a work day to see what life is like with 2 kids, and it's terrified him a little bit. That's all I'll say. He's like, so you mean when you come home, you really just go straight into parenting for the next few hours? It's like, yes.
Yeah.
And I'm actually really grateful for so many people who are a few years ahead of the schedule that I'm on in terms of having kids and stuff. And Daniel was married before me, and I got quite a bit of wisdom from
stand on the shoulder of giants.
That's right.
Oh, that's a great joke.
That would be putting it lightly. But an example is, there have been a lot of changes in the 9 months leading up to this child being here, and they've been really difficult for me. And I'm seeing how if I maintain what I'm doing, it's going to cause more and more problems. And it can be really basic stuff. I'm just really selfish with my time. And when there's something that needs to be done, I want to put it off so that maybe I don't have to do it. And if I do that, it feels good for a split second. I feel like, yes, I got the time to do what I wanted. And then it very quickly feels terrible because I see the consequences of it. And just last night, we had a conversation about it, and I was just fully convicted of, because I'm still behaving this way, which I knew better. I knew better than to, hog time or hog energy, whatever it is, in this way. Now I'm seeing how I've hurt my relationship with my wife, and I thought that I was better. I thought that I had done better than this, and it challenges the view that you have of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And even in prepping the bios that you read at the beginning of the show, it was surprising how hard it was to write a bio, because there's a version of myself that I'm like, oh no, I'm all these things. But as soon as I write it, I think, well, there's no actual evidence.
My wife wouldn't say so.
Well,
we got to have our wives write our bios.
That's a good one, yeah.
Well, what's really funny is Daniel wrote my bio, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. In my original bio, he put, Phil likes working out. And
you do work. I don't. So the fact that you go to the gym like 5 times a week seems like you like working out, and that's because I fundamentally don't understand. You'd said like the back end of, I don't understand technology, so I couldn't write that if I wanted to.
Right. I am not critiquing that.
I mean, you are. It's okay, but you are critiquing it.
I'm a little bit critiquing it. But what was funny to me is I thought, working out is not that important to me. That is not my identity. But then I thought, well, if someone just looked at my schedule, what would they see? And that is something that I save time for. And I thought, is that what I want? Do I want that to be the thing that represents me? And then there are other things that I really feel like this is a part of my identity, but a lot of people don't know about it. So like, I love playing the piano, and we got a piano.
Jealous.
Recently, and I started playing again. I've always played, but I've never really had a way to daily practice since I graduated high school. I just haven't had the place or the machine to do it. But now I do have that. But I'm not that good. If anyone said, okay, play a whole piece for me, I couldn't play a whole piece without making a mistake. And that's hard, because I think to everyone else, a piano player is someone who can play a beautiful piano piece. But it's hard to accept that, this is just a hobby. And I'm not even an enthusiast. I'm not that into it. It's just something that happens to be in my house. And then I love learning languages, but I'm not really good at any of them except English. And I'm still kind of struggling with English.
I'm a language aficionado. What's your favorite English?
The word aficionado came up a lot, and I kept deleting it when I was writing my thing, because that's not what I want either. But I think it's that having the version of yourself that that residual self-image, like they describe in the Matrix. This is how I see myself, and maybe that's not real. And then to have such a beautiful metaphor in the undragoning, I think was incredibly powerful.
What about you, Daniel?
Yeah, I won't pick Eustace, and I won't pick Reepicheep either, just because we talked about these characters, although they're both stand out. They're both wonderful. One of the things that I really love about Dawn Treader, not just in this collection of 7 books, but just in all of children's literature, is the fact that it is a high fantasy story with no antagonist, with no main plot other than just sail east. Yeah, we're going to try to find these 7 guys, but it's clear that that's not, really the driving force for the plot. Kind of the impetus for all of this is a love of adventure and exploration. And I think that's such an interesting thing that and that's why the movie, when we talked about it, years ago, the movie's so bad is because the movie tries to make it about some evil, the green mist, right? My students who have seen the movie call it the avocado mist is what they call it, the avocado mist. And it's because they were just not, the filmmakers were not confident in being able to tell a story that doesn't have an antagonist. There just isn't one. The closest we maybe get is the Dark Island, like the darkness, like that would be the closest we get to an actual antagonist. But everywhere else, and maybe I guess the Duffel Puds, but they're not really in the end. They only are for about a chapter. I guess maybe Gumpus. You have a little bit there, but you don't have any antagonist that isn't just easily overcome. Right? Gumpus is annoying. Yeah. Well, in the same chapter that he's introduced, he's also defeated. The darkness is defeated in the same chapter that's introduced, right? The Duffel Puds turn out to be the least, right, intimidating creatures you could imagine. And Lewis is instead focused on adventure. He's focused on characters. And I just love the fact that it's a story about loves. It's a story about loving adventure, loving courage. One of the reasons we love Reepicheep so much is because he loves the right things, right? St. Augustine talks about this. He talks about loving things in the right order, knowing, loving, what you're supposed to love more than what you shouldn't love, and then loving things that you should love more, not more than things that you should love less. And he talks about that on Christian doctrine. And I think Reepicheep is such a wonderful character in that because his loves are rightly ordered and because we see the way that he's not just courageous because that's his natural proclivity, right? He's courageous because he seems to literally love courage. Eustace is so annoying and frustrating because he loves being a know-it-all, which is that's not something you should love. You shouldn't love being arrogant, but he actually loves to be arrogant. And so I think that's so interesting that Lewis doesn't focus on a fight against good versus evil after 2 books that did focus on that, but instead just almost the stakes are significantly lower and the story's almost more beautiful because of that. So I love that about Dawn Treader. It makes it so unique in all the 7 books.
That was really well said. I like that. Let's jump on to the silver chair, gentlemen. So let's start. This time we'll go with Daniel.
Silver chair. All right. What an interesting, Silver Chair comes right on the heels of Dawn Treader, which has very little Aslan in it. And then here it is, Aslan in chapter 2. She's like, here's a long extended scene with Jill. And there's a lot of great things here. Puddleglum's wonderful. It's great being underground. It's cool to see some of that. The House of the Giants is fantastic. And I love the journey to the north. But Jill is actually my standout. I actually like her probably more than Puddleglum himself. In that Jill, as she is a character with Eustace in the book before, he's annoying. Like I said, he loves being arrogant. He's just an actual jerk. Jill is not. Jill is just cynical. And she's really the first cynical character introduced in these books. Because I really think Eustace, what's going on in his heart is not cynicism. It's something even worse than that. But Jill just is, she's not quite sure. She's very skeptical, and not just of the world of Narnia or skeptical of Aslan. She's skeptical of herself. She's kind of down on herself often and frustrated with herself. And Lewis is doing this very purposefully. Jill is coming from the experiment house. She's had this quote unquote modern education. She has not had what we might call traditional or a classical education. Lewis wouldn't have used this kind of terms, but he would have said the way that we were educated up into the 20th century was just significantly different. And here is Jill in this very kind of, modern education. And one of the things Lewis is doing is he's saying this is kind of what that education breeds. It breeds cynicism and skepticism. And what's interesting, I'd love to think more about this. I haven't really paid enough attention to this, is how much Lewis is saying that Jill recognizes that. Is it that modern education from Lewis's perspective makes you cynical about everything, but accidentally makes you cynical even about yourself? Or is that kind of part of the plan all along? Because Jill regularly, she gets mad at herself for not remembering the signs, and then she's not even sure if it's worth remembering the signs. And that kind of thing, I would say that I, as a modern, or I guess a postmodern myself, right, I do live, right, and I was born in the 20th century and I live in the 21st. And so because of that, I find myself the most like Jill, because the way that she thinks and views the world is most similar to the way that I was raised to think and view the world. And that has nothing to do with, one of the things we do try to do in classical education is help change that paradigm shift, but that's still great. You're in school for 6 hours a day. That's, you still live in this world for 24 hours of the day. So I think it's really interesting the way that he uses Jill to show the way that our worldview and that our minds have literally shifted in a modern and postmodern world.
I like that. How about yourself, Phil?
Yeah, to me, it was the silver chair itself as a prop, and I don't know why this was, but for some reason early on, it felt like a metaphor for addiction, and just, I'm reading this in elementary school, so I don't know how much actual addiction there was, but I do remember the wanting so bad to be good and still struggling. And then later relating to Paul talking about this in the Bible. But wanting so bad to be good was just so difficult. And I remember, specifically wanting to be good because I wanted more Christmas presents.
My parents did the whole naughty nice thing with Santa, and that
nice.
traumatized me into realizing, oh man,
Yeah.
I got to win my gifts and earn them.
Yeah, years unpacking that.
Yeah.
But it was the fact that when he was in the chair, so before he gets in the chair, he's warning them, don't let me out no matter what. And then you think that he's undergoing something terrible, but what he's really doing is he's waking up to their terrible reality, and he's aware of it for the first time consciously that day. And it's this horrible thing. But I also remember just the power of saying in the name of Aslan, and how much that stuck with me. I didn't remember anything else about the book for years, but it was that moment. I remember it being read to me, and I also remember seeing it in the movie. It's a tough scene to watch, especially as a kid. And that BBC adaptation on the VHS tapes that we checked out from the church library, it was the scariest thing I had seen at the time, I think. And it really made me think, like, oh, like which one is real? Like, if you feel bad about something, is it because that was the wrong thing to do? When you did that bad thing, was it really that fun? Was it really that worth it? Because now you're seeing the consequences of it. And just now we've read the book 2 more times. We've seen the BBC adaptation again, and hopefully we'll get a adaptation on Netflix at some point in the next 10 years. But that moment has always stood out.
I love that too. That the 2 things that I had written down were, I just remember very vividly going through it in real time and thinking how different Aslan's influence was of giving the 4 signs ahead of time to guide them, and then on the journey forgetting it. And I thought of that quote, David brought it up, holding on in the light what we once knew to be true, holding on in the darkness what we once knew to be true in the light. And it's like, we can be very confident of truth. We can feel like God has placed something in our heart, then go on the actual journey, and all of the influences are going to try to derail you from that are incredible. And it can be really tough. And so that was something that really stuck out with me. In addition, exactly what you said, Silverchair, I kind of phrased it a little bit more, that whole just enchantment itself. How relatable that scene, that passage, that section was. I mean, the world tries to enchant us away from what we know to be true. And I love, like, in the name of Aslan, I love how you have to just fight it with truth. You have to recognize it. I mean, there was just so much wisdom in that. It was very powerful. This one was in the running for one of my favorites because that message to me was incredibly beautiful. I love that message. What you'll learn with me is, like The Great Divorce being my favorite book of Lewis's, we always have a debate on that. We've never actually had a debate on that. We always joke about, we all have different views of that. Andrew has Till We Have Faces. And really it comes down to, what is your definition of best? And most of us don't actually discuss that. And so when it comes down to it, for me, what defines best is like what ends up communicating like the most powerful truth that can stick with you and bring you to heaven. Like, and I know that most literature people wouldn't put that as the definition of best for a book. So that's the ones of these that stick out to me the most are the ones that the lessons that I still remember to this day and that carry with me.
In particular, it's the phrase, there's Aslan, and just the way it breaks all of the work that the Lady of the Green Girdle did before. He just says, yeah, and all that, sure, but there's Aslan. And I find myself thinking that a lot whenever I'm starting to get really down about whatever is currently in the news at the time. Well, there's Aslan. There's Jesus.
I love it. Let's go to the horse and his boy. And Phil, we are going to have you kick this off.
To me, Shasta and his secret twin, you get these little glimpses of it, and then the big reveal, but then also just their interactions. It gives me so much joy just to think about it. But it also, I'm not sure how into the Marvel Cinematic Universe you are, but the very last movie of kind of the whole Infinity Stone arc, Infinity Saga, where they're rehashing things that happened in previous movies because they're going back to those scenes, and you're seeing it from a different perspective. Having these characters appear when they're not the main characters, and so you're seeing it from a different person's perspective, and they're just kind of side characters. There's something else going on. The way that it connected it to that same world, but it didn't rely on that. And it also wasn't doing it just to say, oh, remember so-and-so? Because they're over there. Everything fit the story overall. And just the fact that not everybody was featured. Not everybody had a great line. They didn't have a full story arc. There's just, those characters are still here, but it's not all about them. There's something wonderful about that.
I loved the whole theme of identity. I think that's just so profound, particularly as we know identity as Christ's beloved. But the world tells us differently. You know, he was born the son of a king. We are born sons of God. Like we get to partake in that. But it is incredible to me how the world tries to tell us otherwise. And I loved that journey, that arc of identity. I just thought that was so beautiful, so powerful. I loved Aslan's role. One of my favorite scenes in it is in the back half when the lions are chasing him and he doesn't really realize this is Aslan. And then he kind of hears the breathing. And then finally it's revealed to him that it's been Aslan this whole time, and the cat and the lions. It was one lion going back and forth, spooking his horse into it. It's like, this was one of I think my favorite ones of Aslan's influence. It's that journey of not realizing he's the son of a king. The entire journey is being guided by Aslan, but in a very unknown way. He wouldn't have known that story. He wouldn't have known who he is. And then when it's revealed to him and the beauty, we had Dr. Glyer on, and she read that part where the breathing and he can't tell who it is and what it is. And he's afraid. And it's obviously Aslan. And it's one of her favorite scenes in all of Lewis's books. And I would agree. It's just it's so incredible. So this was in a short running for my favorite. I mean, really could have come down to the last battle, Dawn Treader, Silverchair, or Horse and His Boy. I think my four favorite, which is over half.
4 out of the 7.
Yeah. Definitely in the top 10.
I can't believe I didn't say Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, but like I think I like it for the reasons Daniel did say. It's just so beautiful, the world you're getting introduced to. But yeah, so Horse and His Boy. What about you, Daniel? What really sticks out to you?
Yeah, one of the things I just love, I mean, the stuff that y'all have said has been really great too. One of the things that I love about it is just the change in scenery. The change in setting is really interesting. And on top of that too is the way that Lewis kind of plays a little bit with the narrative structure of it. I really love, my favorite parts of The Horse and His Boy are actually the middle parts, where it's kind of going back and forth. They're in Tashbaan, and then we see a little bit of Aravis's story while she's still stuck there, but Shasta has escaped. It's kind of going back and forth a little bit. I really enjoy when they're in Tashbaan, because it's really the first time we've been in a place that isn't wonderful and beautiful. Like, we learn that there's a lot of injustice there. There's a lot of bad things that are regularly going on. And so we haven't really seen much of that besides maybe a little bit of Narrowhaven and Dawn Treader. Everywhere we've really visited, there's been only maybe pockets of injustice, or like you think about like House of Harfang and Silverchair, but we haven't seen an entire city that is like that. And I actually find it really enjoyable to be there. Lazareline is such a fantastic character here because she brings this complexity of, she's not bad because of what she does, but she just doesn't do good. So like I talked about at the very beginning of this, when we talked about, it's not that we don't want to, I want my son to not just, I want him to avoid, both of my kids to avoid bad books or bad stories or bad movies, but I also want them to enjoy good things too. And Lazareline seems to be, her view of morality is simply just not doing something bad. It's not about doing good. It's just don't do the bad thing and then you're fine. You've done your role. It's like the bare minimum. And she views that as being a very moral thing. So I find her character very interesting. I love the dynamic between her and Aravis. I think they have like 2 chapters together, and those are my 2 favorite chapters of the book. Maybe two of my favorite chapters in all of the Chronicles, because I really just enjoy those 2.
High praise. Magician's Nephew. You guys will see. I have nothing on this one. Not that I didn't end up liking it, but I was like, that nothing really stuck out to me, and I didn't go back to my notes. What about you guys for The Magician's Nephew?
I wonder if some people, this is their absolute favorite. I mean, again, and then there's people like, it sounds like you, Matt, and I would probably put myself a little bit more in this camp that it's definitely not one of my favorites. And I guess my critique of it, and maybe why I feel like it doesn't resonate as deeply with me, and why I think, ironically, that maybe some of the magic is a little missing, is it honestly feels to me like the one that Lewis felt, instead of the story coming to him, it felt the one he was most obligated to write. And for two reasons in particular. I think he felt obligated to, and again, I'm not, okay, I shouldn't say I think this because I don't know at all. I think it feels like he's obligated to write it to tell the beginning of Narnia. Right. So you got to tell that early story. And so whenever you go back into a prequel, you now have a lot of other stipulations you have to work with because you got to make it work into the original story. And you're starting out with the idea for a story, which you always start with an idea, I should say, but you're starting out with kind of a lot more that you have to do, and you cannot just let the story kind of take over. And so he's got the obligation to tell the genesis of Narnia. And then two is this more interesting, more psychological obligation that he really is in some ways kind of telling a revised history of his own childhood. Right? You have a boy living in England at the turn of the century whose mother is sick, right? And who he just wants to see healed. And we see that Diggory is able to heal his mother. He gets the happy ending that Lewis didn't get. Obviously, his mother dies before he hits 10 years old. She dies of cancer. And, Lewis, I think in writing that, and again, I like this book. Don't get me wrong. I really enjoy this book. I think it's a great book. But as far as, it's probably my least favorite of the seven. My biggest critique of it would be just these two things, that I feel like it's an obligation to, tell the genesis of Narnia and to kind of write retell the story of his own childhood. And I think some of the beauty gets a little lost in that. And that doesn't take away from especially how beautiful chapters 8, 9, and 10 are when Aslan is creating Narnia, or how frightening chapter 4 and 5 are when they're in Charn, because those are great, but it just, to me, doesn't pack as many punches as the other books.
100% agree. How do you feel, Phil?
Yeah, to me, Uncle Andrew as a character, he stands out so much. I think because I tend to understand some of the things that evil characters do. And to me, when I read these things, it's a warning of, oh, this is the end of that. If you follow this path, this is where that leads. Yeah. And little things like, oh, the rules don't apply to me. The rules are for everybody else, but I'm special for whatever blank reason. And it can be a very minor thing, in high school, downloading music that you're not paying for. I'm like, well, I don't have very much money. So, that's not really, those rules aren't for me, or whatever it is.
This is what you told yourself when you downloaded LimeWire. You were like, it's okay that I'm doing that.
Napster.
I didn't do LimeWire or Napster. It was just slightly after that. But I did pay $30 for what was essentially a PDF on how to download stuff. They sold it as a unlimited music for $30 one-time payment. And it's one, very early.
That the FBI can actually hear this podcast. You know that, right?
Yeah, I think they have too much going on.
I'm more surprised that they didn't steal your credit card information.
Yeah,
putting something on like for that.
Yeah.
Like a phishing scam.
It probably was safer to actually just download LimeWire or uTorrent. I don't know these things exist. That's what I've been told people use.
uTorrent is what it actually was.
They literally tell you for $30, go to uTorrent. It's all free.
I learned a lot of valuable lessons that season. I'm banking on the fact that there are so many podcasts now that the FBI doesn't have time to take notes on all of them. And
this is only true for so much longer. AI and ML, they're going to be. Yeah,
they can just mine it for. Mine it for. Give me a list of all the confessions to pirating over the past 25 years.
100%. Yeah. Right now, thankfully, the data would just take too much computational abilities, and the government probably doesn't have the manpower like these private businesses to figure that out. But that is coming in the future. Well, they're just going to data mine the heck out of it.
That's why they were spending all that effort making your smart TV turn the microphone on and just send all the information back. Man, when that stuff came out, And the names it had, it was like Project Archangel and stuff. It's like, woof, this is it's dicey. Anyway, just a character like that where he's not actually that good, and he doesn't even understand how the rings work. But the fact that he was using this little bit of power and then thinking that he had a different set of rules or no rules or whatever it was. But then also just some of the scenery and some of the setting. So the fact that there's this secret attic passageway type thing. And, I'm just picturing this much older house, much older than we have access to here in the States. And then also just when they were in Charn and you see all the people in a row, and then that temptation to ring the bell, and how once you ring it, you can't resist that temptation, then all the stuff that comes as a result. And that bell was there for a reason. They knew that someone eventually would come and ring it, and why things like that are so dangerous. And also the way that fits into the time period. And just I don't know for sure how much that relates to weapons of mass destruction and things like that, but it definitely seems like it was around the same time that was really on people's conscience. These weapons now exist, and is it only a matter of time before someone uses one again after the initial two during World War II?
Well said. Well, gentlemen, I realize we kind of already did the last battle in the beginning. Unless you had additional thoughts that came to your mind, everything I had written here I'd already said in the beginning, because I think that was the freshest for us, the most recent. Was there anything additional with the last battle? Don't feel any pressure if you already feel your piece that you said it.
Not for me, no. I loved, as I mentioned, just kind of Lewis just really unleashing like Platonic theory at the very end.
Yes.
And making it feel so real. I find it really exciting, really beautiful, and really impactful.
To me, the standout is just the way that you can take a good thing and twist it a little bit and make it so horrible. And I think this kind of relates to something we were talking about earlier, where this thing is not bad in and of itself. And when people say, like, there's nothing wrong with blank, I agree. But I also think we are not called to not do bad things. We are called to do good things. And one of the core desires in my heart is to strive for what is best, not just avoid the bad things. And I just think that sometimes when we get stuck in that, it's the wrong question. And both of those themes were very present in the last battle.
Well, gentlemen, this has been an incredible conversation. It was so fun to be able to rehash and rethink through all of this, and particularly for some of our listeners that are maybe like myself, that the reading of this series was very fragmented. It's really cool to be able to just see all the themes in real time quickly over like an hour and a half as we just recorded, and to have like even some of the overarching ideas that they can connect it all to. So I'm just so grateful that you guys came on to be able to do this. We've already talked about what your guys' future is for the Lamppost listener, but is there anything you guys want to leave them with of where they can find out more about you guys? Obviously, your podcast, Lamppost listener, is the number one thing, but anything else before we wrap this up?
Yeah, we have a website. Daniel put a lot of great work into this, and it's pretty fun to be able to show it around. It's lamppostlistener.com.
I'm going to go check it out.
Yeah, besides that, you can email us at hello@lamppostlistener.com.
That's a good one. Everyone does contact. I love that.
Yeah.
We did contact. Hello,
at lamppostlistener.com. We have a Patreon as well, too. We'll be back. We're coming back season 8. Lord willing, season 8 starts in May of 2024 here. So we'll be coming back. First, we're going to look at some of the eschatology of the last battle. How does Lewis view the end times? We're also looking at some of his essays, like 3 Ways of Writing for Children. Then we're going to even start diving into some other ideas around myth and about beautiful stories. We'll look at things like Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. And it's just going to be a really fun season of us really exploring, kind of like we've done today, exploring the why behind a lot of these great stories.
That's incredible.
I'm so grateful for the opportunity to do this quick tour of all 7 books now that we've both read it. And it makes me even more excited for season 8 coming up, because I realized that now that we've read all of them over the course of several years, we've changed a lot and we have a different perspective, and it's going to be fun to kind of dive back in and talk about things from maybe a slightly more distance view, kind of like a higher level, looking at everything at once and seeing how things interrelate and connect.
Well, I hear the call for final drinks, so thank you to our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah. Thanks to our intern, Julia. Thanks to all our listeners and Patreon supporters, particularly our top tier ones, Mary Margaret. That's my fiance. Aldo, Alex, James, Matt, Erica, Joao, Amanda, Thomas, Bud 1, Bud 2, Shane, K, Paul, Gary, Stephen, Kelly, Chris, John, James, Kate, Peter, David, Angela, and Rowdy. And we pray for all of our listeners and all of the prayer requests in our Slack channel every Tuesday. If you've enjoyed this episode, guys, please share it. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Lamppost Listener, because first and foremost, they were the bulk of this conversation. And please share this. I mean, this is such a good episode where it's a one-off where people can learn so much about Narnia. Hopefully they've read the books or they're going to hate you. But yes, maybe ask them that first. But please share it, like, subscribe. All of that stuff helps us, guys. If you listen to one podcast, David probably should have changed that. If you listen to two podcasts, please join us next time on this one and the other one.
He knows what he said.
Please join us next time
when we'll be going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers, y'all.
Lament upon the Finishing of a Beloved Book by Douglas McKelvey. From Every Moment Holy, Volume 1, page 95. I am stirred and saddened, O Lord, in coming to this tale's end, to bid farewell and return now from my sojourn in that story place, where longings for something more than the life I lead were wakened. It is in the receding glow of that small bright sorrow that I now linger. Let it do its work in me, inviting me to dig beneath these fresh-stirred longings, to see that their roots are not at last a longing for the places depicted in these pages, but are in truth profound and holy wounds, yearnings for a lost garden and a more perfect city, where justice and righteousness are restored, and harms are healed, and losses redeemed, and love proved true, and earth and heaven reconciled. What I feel is, at its heart, a homesick hope for a place of unbroken communion with my Creator, and with His people, and with all of His creation. What I most desire is to open my eyes and find that, for the first time in my life, I am home and breathing the wild winds of my native land. So of course my heart aches each time I receive these beautiful, distant rumors of that far country. Of course I do not want such a story to end, for it has wedged open for me a way like a window, through which I have glimpsed a vision of things more as they will one day be, than as they now are in these hard and sorrowing lands of our exile. Thank you, O my God, for loving me enough that you would rouse my deepest desires again through story, appointing these longings as true signposts, planted in a war-torn and cratered landscape, reminding me that all of history is leading at last to a king and a kingdom, and pointing me ever onward towards his righteous and eternal city. May I return now, from the world of this book, to the daily details of my own life, with truer vision and fiercer hope, trailing with me remnants of that coming glory I have glimpsed again in story. Amen.